Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Coastlines. We acknowledge that the lands on which Memorial University's campuses are situated are in the traditional territories of diverse Indigenous groups. Good evening, everyone. And we acknowledge, welcome to Coastline. With respect, we acknowledge that the lands on which Memorial University's campuses are situated. We acknowledge with respect the histories and cultures of the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit of this province. We encourage everyone to reflect on the lands where you are located and the Indigenous peoples for whom these lands are traditional territories. We are pleased to welcome you to Coastlines with alumni Anne Budgell, where we will discuss her fascinating book, Dear Everybody. In addition to having the author herself here this evening, we also have our always wonderful host, Angela Antle. Unfortunately, Dr. Ashley Consolo, the founding dean of the School of Arctic and Subarctic Studies of the Labrador campus of Memorial University, was unable to join us this evening. However, we are very, very lucky to have Mina Campbell joining us. Mina is an Inuk artist and curator of the Labrador Interpretation Center in Northwest River, and we are so grateful that she has been able to join us on such short notice. Viewers, please type your questions into WebEx, or if you're watching on YouTube, into the comment box on YouTube, and myself or Heidi will make sure they get asked. And now I would like to introduce our effervescent host, Angela Antle. Angela holds a Bachelor of Arts from Memorial, is a current PhD candidate, congratulations, Angela, and a documentary producer. Throughout her 30-plus year career at CBC, she mentored producers to create award-winning narrative radio documentaries. We are so blessed to have her as our host, and I'm now going to pass things over to Angela.
Thanks, Janet. I don't know, but effervescent pixelated might be a better descriptor tonight. There's something up with my internet, so I apologize to everyone if I seem a little robotic. Hopefully the audio is okay. A warm welcome to Anne, a former colleague of mine, Anne Budgell, and I'm so pleased to meet in this format Mina from Northwest River. I'm thrilled to be back hosting another Coastlines, and tonight we're discussing Anne Budgell's Dear Everybody, a woman's journey from Park Avenue to a Labrador trapline. Now, events in the book take place between 1944 and 48, starting when Manhattan socialite Barbara Mundy left a life of privilege and traveled to Northwest River as a volunteer with the Grenfell Mission. She quickly became enamored with the area's beauty, and soon after that, with one of its trappers. Hope I'm not giving too much away there. Finding life in Labrador more intriguing and more satisfying than life among New York's social elite. She discovered a love for hunting, canoeing, and camping, and for fur trapper Russell Groves. They married in 1947, and Barbara convinced Russell to take her along for the winter on his trapline. One of only a few women, especially white women, who were able to do that. So this book is also a great record of that life. However, accustomed to a life of solitude, Russell had little patience for his new bride's lack of experience during their first 2 tumultuous years together. Barbara wrote daily diary entries chronicling the difficulties faced by a couple drawn together from vastly different backgrounds, and our author uses the diaries as well as Barbara Mundy's letters and notes to tell this remarkable story, bringing readers back to a remote place and time through the eyes of a born adventurer. Now, Anne, who, as mentioned, is a Memorial alumna with BA 95, she also grew up an Air Force brat, living on military bases all over Canada until her parents returned home to Labrador in 1966. Anne had a long career as a radio and television journalist with CBC Newfoundland and Labrador and retired in 2007. She credits her parents with instilling in her an interest in Labrador and its history. Her father, George, grew up in Rigolette, the son of a Hudson's Bay company factor. Her mother, Ruby, grew up in Northwest River, the daughter of a fur trapper. Anne, thanks so much for being here.
My pleasure to be here.
And I'd also like to welcome Mina Campbell. Mina is an Inuk woman from the Northwest River as well. She's worked as the curator of the Labrador Interpretation Center, a cultural center representing Labrador's cultures since 1998. She was raised by her grandparents, who instilled in her their traditional heritage and lifestyle. She practices many traditional hunting, fishing, and land-based activities, and she's interested in teaching and passing on her skills while continuing to learn more. We're so grateful that you're joining us, Mina. Welcome.
Thank you. It's Mina.
I know, sorry. We're going to start off the night with a reading from Anne. Anne, you're going to tell us a little bit about this portion of your book, and then we'd like to hear your words.
Sure. One of the things I wanted to do with this book was to put a lot of information in here about Labrador. So it's obviously the story of Russell and Barbara, but it's also, I stuck a lot of other information about Labrador in there, and there were themes. And in this section I'm going to read now, it's about how, it was tough on a trap line. I mean, you could be hungry sometimes. They carried hundreds of pounds of food with them in their canoes when they would go up the river in the fall. But you had to be so careful about doling that out, and you had to be trying to shoot some birds or kill a caribou or something to have something to eat over those months of time, because you were there alone and there was no store to go to. So the section I'm going to read from is from November of 1947. They've been on the trap line only a few weeks at this point because it took them a long time to get up there. It was way up in the Elizabeth River, Fig River area, way up beyond Lake Michikamau on the Churchill River. So way up in the interior of Labrador, almost in Quebec. The first bit here is from Barbara's diary from November 13th. She says, "Today, November 13th, we had a nice walk, not a mouthful of meat to even see. Went up the river till it was open, cut in north and followed a brook, then across a pond and back to river and hit it exactly at Russell's last trap. He tried to make me think he knew that's where he'd come out. He's smart, I know, but not that smart. Wish it had been clear. I'd love to get the mountains proper." She means taking a photograph. "And a deer would have meant a lot to our tummies." Food was a preoccupation on the trap line. Barbara recorded nearly every partridge, beaver, and porcupine they killed. They would have been doomed to a nearly meatless diet without partridges. In mid-November, when she was wishing for a meal of caribou, she may have wondered if the Innu way of doing things made some sense after all. Russell would have killed a caribou if he had seen any, but he wasn't spending much time hunting. Some trappers found caribou too heavy to haul around and didn't bother hunting them. When Innu found caribou, they would kill as many as possible, eat as much as they could, and harvest all edible or usable parts of the animals before moving on. Mathieu Mestocosho recalled a great hunt in 1925 when they killed 30 animals one day and 77 a day later. "We had more than 100 caribou to eat. Meat was stored on scaffolds if they had any left over when it was shared. Caribou skins were processed, the hides used for boots, clothing, and bed covers, and to make babiche, thin strips of rawhide used for the webbing in snowshoes or to lash fur boards and toboggans. They pounded every bit of marrow out of the bones." Innu knew what it was like to be hungry. People had starved to death and nearly starved when hunting was poor. During the winter of 1930, Mestocosho's grandfather told him to look around the area for other Innu families who may need meat. They climbed the mountain near Lake Keshikashau and spotted a tent beside the lake. 2 families from Northwest River were there with hardly any food. They made a plan to meet a few days later to share what they had. Sometimes the circumstances were desperate enough to be brought to official attention, although with little good result. In 1928, Hudson Bay Company factor John Keats wrote to Roman Catholic Reverend Edward J. O'Brien from Davis Inlet to warn him he would find his flock in bad shape when he came to Labrador in the summer. O'Brien was a priest from Newfoundland who went to Davis Inlet and Northwest River to minister to the Innu. Keats wrote this: "I am sorry to say that we have had a very, very poor year. Far inland, the Indians barely caught enough to pay their fall outfit. and some of them have been living on Newfoundland government relief this spring to keep from starving. Hope you will find conditions better at Northwest River, although I imagine the Indians that hunt to the north will have very little. Another letter written to O'Brien dated August 31st, 1948 by Hudson Bay Company factor Max Budgell, my uncle, by the way, was written for Joe Rich, the chief of the Davis Inlet Band, and it told the sad news of the previous winter when children died of starvation. We have left Davis Inlet and are going to live in Newtok. We don't know yet whether it will be better or not, but we are going to try it and hope to get more deer than there are in Davis Inlet. We are sorry to leave the church, and we are sorry because we haven't seen the priest. Last year we had a hard winter. 3 children starved because we were too far in the country and bad weather stopped us before we could go to Davis Inlet. When there was starvation, it was never because people weren't hunting and sharing. And when families were desperate, food in a trapper's tilt would be taken. The Innu people Barbara and Russell saw signs of that winter were not desperate, though. They were actively hunting and perhaps having more luck than their trapper neighbors.
It's so interesting that you chose that portion of the book, because I was reviewing the book this afternoon, and I was really struck by how interdependent and connected everybody is in Northwest River and in Goose Bay.
Yes, you know, when you mention that, the trappers who went deep into the country traveled together, and you saw that picture where Russell's paddling the canoe in the front and there are other canoes strung out behind him.
Fabulous picture,
together, yeah. And one by one, they would drop off when they would come to their trapping grounds. But they had always made a prearranged agreement, the ones who were nearest to each other, that on a certain date, say in mid-December, they would meet up. And that was because if someone didn't come to the meeting, other people would go to where that person's trapping grounds were and look for him. Something might have happened. Something bad might have happened. So they were very interdependent. And even though there was no satellite phones and no way of communicating other than getting on your snowshoes and walking or paddling your canoe, they did have a way of keeping tabs on each other.
Mina, I want to bring you into the conversation. Just how rare was it for a woman to go trapping with her husband?
Yeah, well, it was quite rare, especially for women from away, not except for the who lived that and women, but for a woman from Manhattan living the high and rich life out there. But then to also go into the trap line for 6 months with her husband was certainly a feat and something to tackle. And to stay there for 6 months and still be happy in the end, even though they had lots of ups and downs, and they could have had ups and downs wherever they were. But to be able to do that was quite a feat for any woman, especially outside woman, to be.
And she went back for the second winter.
Yeah.
I didn't write about it in the book because it was too much of a repetition of what I had already written about, but she went back for the second winter.
Yeah, I paddled down Churchill River, Grand River with Elizabeth Panashway a number of years back, and that was enough for me. It's a lot and a lot to spend, you know, the winter months and the uncertainty of, you know, what your next meal is going to be, and so many different things for anybody, but especially for a woman from outside. Yes.
And she talks in the book about how difficult it was to steer the canoe. She could paddle a canoe before she left, but not one weighed down with 6 months worth of supplies. So she was also kind of a danger to their safety, right?
Yeah, she was. Yeah.
Was. If it was something that I'm sure it caused a lot of tension and created a lot of anxiety for Russell, because he knew that her life was in his hands. And And I think she was aware of that, but it didn't press upon her. I mean, he knew much more about how dangerous it was. He had been going up that river since he was about 14 or 15 years of age. So for 20 years, he'd been going up that river. He knew that other people had drowned going up the river or down the river or went through the ice in the spring or whatever. It was an incredibly dangerous line of work. But Barbara was, if you read the book, everybody listening to me has read the book. She was singing in the canoe when they were paddling up, and she thought Russell was irritated with her because to him, that was probably not paying the sufficient amount of attention to the situation at that time.
Mina, I jumped in and asked you a question, but I'm sure you have a question for Anne.
I didn't have a question for her, but I have a comment to make to her, and I think that it's very important that this book is important because it documents not only two people's lives and the lifestyle on the trap line, but it shows the way that all trappers would have had to survive on the trap lines. So it's a good documentation of history of the trappers and their lifestyles. So thank you for doing that, taking letters and documenting them to make a book.
Lucky for me, I had such a lot of really good material to work on, but there's also the business of having some of this stuff instilled in me from a young age. I mean, I thought about my grandparents when I was writing this book. I thought about my grandfather, Murdoch McLean, who was a trapper, my grandmother, May McLean. My mother was born in a cabin at the Nascapi River at the end of Grand Lake, not Grand River, Grand Lake. And, this was in 1922. It was 100 years ago. When I tell people that my mother was born in a log cabin and no doctors, no nurses, no nothing, they look at me like, you must be making that up. But this is not an unusual story in Labrador, as Mina will verify.
Mhm.
Tell us a little bit about your main character and how privileged her life was, because she just wasn't middle class, American. She was of the elite.
Well, I did a fair bit of research on those families, and because they were so wealthy, there was a lot of material. I mean, you could tap their names into the New York Times and stuff would come up. There'd be stories about the men, because on one side of her family, they were very involved in the sugar business. They owned mills, they manufactured sugar. They almost had a lock on the market, I think, until that was made illegal. But they were very, very wealthy people. When her family moved to Manhattan from Montclair, New Jersey, which is a really wealthy little suburban area outside of New York, they moved into an apartment that was the full 10th floor of a building on Park Avenue. It was a brand new building. It was 5,000 square feet. They had servants' quarters. They had an elevator to their floor. I mean, I was in New York. I went there to go to the library and do some research. And I went to that building. And of course, it's all divided up into much smaller units now. But yeah, they were rich. I mean, they all went to private boarding schools. She and her sister and brother, they all went to university. When Barbara was going to a women's college in Connecticut, she had her own car. They were extremely privileged. In the wintertime, they'd go to Glacier National Park to go skiing. In the summer, they rented a house in Maine. So yeah, they were well off, very well off.
And yet during the war, she sent home partridges.
Yeah.
Yeah, because if you went down to any butcher shop in New York, that would be a delicacy.
I love that part of the story. There's a certain amount of loss in this book too, and when you look at the maps, everything has changed so much with the Muskrat Falls Reservoir, and the rapids are gone, and that way of life, in a large part is gone. Did you feel that kind of loss when you were researching it? You have such close connections to Labrador, familial connections.
Well, it predates Muskrat Falls. Don't forget about the Lower Churchill.
Right.
The Lower Churchill, when they flooded it to create the reservoir, made it one of the largest lakes in Canada. I mean, there was a huge amount of territory flooded by the Lower Churchill. Guess whose land that's on? It's indigenous land, you know, but there was no discussion about that then. And I mean, it's only now in the recent years that there's been any actual discussion about that, or that anybody's paying any attention to that. Um, you know, the muskrat, yeah, the falls were lost, but the trappers regarded those falls as more of a nuisance, I think, than anything else. I mean, they were beautiful to look at and a beautiful part of the river, but that was the big portage they had to go up, get up the hill and get up to the higher level and get around them. The other kinds of losses, well, I mean, when the military base was built in Labrador in the early 1940s, 1942, they just went in there and just took over the property. And Uncle Bob's berry bush, I mentioned in the book, Robert Michelin had his partridge berry picking area was there. Everybody called it Uncle Bob's berry bush. Well, that's where the runways are now. So, I mean, there's been a history, and it's not just since Muskrat Falls, of things being exploited and used in Labrador without any consultation at all, or very little even now, about you know, to whom it will be affected by, the people that will be affected by these things.
Right. Mina, did you have any feelings about that when you were reading the book?
I did, yes, because both my grandfathers trapped on Grand River. Cache River with Cyril Michelin. Cyril Michelin, Florence Michelin were her best friends in her earlier years and later years, I think, because she stood for them at their wedding. And also my grandfather, Dan Campbell, who trapped on Wilson Lake and Wilson River, all their trap lines, and many, many more people's trap lines, and the flooded at that time. It certainly made me think about that, and it made me feel sad about it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, when Russell got out of trapping, I mean, he stuck at it for a long time. I mean, he didn't work on the base until his first wife was very ill. He didn't want to work on the base. He wanted to trap, but the price of fur got so low, there was no point in doing it. So there were market reasons and economic reasons why a lot of people got out of trapping, plus the fact that there were other jobs that paid a lot more, much closer to home. I think, though, for some of the men, actually, I'm going to insert a funny story here. My grandfather, Murdoch McLean, finally gave up trapping and got a job on the base at Goose Bay. And back then, you'd still be gone from home. You couldn't drive home. There was no road to connect to Northwest River. So you were gone for weeks and weeks until you could get a boat ride home or walk home or whatever, walk home in your snowshoes. And he had a little tilt. He made a little tilt just off the base. Although he had a room in the bunkhouse, he wanted to stay in the little tilt. And that's where he was quite happy. And my Aunt Merle was a member of the RCAF, the Royal Canadian Air Force, and she was a military police woman. She was told to go down and arrest her father because he wasn't supposed to have a camp down there.
That's funny. How did Barbara first become aware of Labrador, first make that connection?
Well, it was because there was this huge volunteer force of society women in New York that had been going on ever since the start of the Grenfell mission. I mean, there were hundreds of women who adored Dr. Grenfell. I mean, he was a celebrity, you know, on the ranks of the biggest celebrities in the world right now. He was, if he gave a lecture, thousands of people came. And so all these society women who wanted to do something useful and be useful, like Barbara, got involved as volunteers with the Grenfell mission. They had sales, they had the opera benefits, they donated clothing that they packed up to ship to Labrador. So it was through that work. But when she finally did decide to go to Labrador, yeah, I think my thought was it coincided with an engagement breaking up, and I think she just wanted to get out of town and get as far away as possible and try and forget about a heartbreak.
And yet when she was there, she found a kind of peace that she never had in Manhattan.
She did, and she wrote about that very eloquently. Over and over again, she said that, you know, she could go out the door in Northwest River and she'd be greeted by people and spoke to people. And she felt very welcome there. And she said, I have more going on here than I had ever had in New York with, I don't know, 5 or 6 million people, I guess, at the time that she left it. Yeah, she felt very, very comfortable in Northwest River.
I think, can I say something?
Go ahead.
I think she also did something that a lot of people from away, I'll say from away, had to do, and that was really got involved with the community and the community people. And she talks about how, she got more friends in the community than she do with some of her co-workers and some of the other staff that were working with the mission at the time. She really got involved with the people and the lifestyles in the community. And that's how come everybody loved her so much.
Yes, and she did comment too that some of the other people who came there to work didn't do that.
Mhm.
And I spoke to a bunch of my relatives, and Mina, you would know them all. And I had a whole bunch of people sitting around the living room, and I said, is it true that at times that the Grenfell Mission told volunteers who came to Labrador that they were not to fraternize, they were not to, go around with the local people. They didn't want them to have close friendships that might develop into love relationships or whatever. And everybody said, oh yeah, that's true, that's true, that's true. But they were told not to fraternize. And it was for all kinds of different reasons. But Barbara paid absolutely no attention to that. One of the reasons also that she felt quite comfortable going her own way was when she went there, she was 34 years old. She wasn't a little kid. She wasn't 18 or 19 years old. As many of the volunteers went up there as young people, teenagers and stuff, and they were more likely to be ordered around. But Barbara was not going to be ordered around like that.
I wanted to ask about how Russell, the fur trapper she eventually marries, how he courted her.
Well, the story that I put in the book and that was told to me, or did I read it in the? No, Barbara wrote about this. I put this in the book. She wrote this in a letter to her sister, I think, that Barbara had been helping in the hospital. She had some training as a nurse's aide. And she'd been helping in the hospital at a very busy time. And Florence Gowdy, who Mina just mentioned, was the only nurse working in the hospital then because it was during wartime. And there was a woman in the hospital having babies, having twins. I think that's right. And there were sick people too. There were, including Russell's first wife, Jane. Jane had tuberculosis and she was dying. And Florence asked Barbara to sit with Jane and be with Jane. And Jane and Barbara were together when Jane died. I mean, Barbara was there trying to comfort Jane when Jane died. Russell was on the base then working in Goose Bay. So they would have sent word up to him that his wife had died, which would be no surprise to him. And so he would have come back then when they had the funeral and so on. But sometime later, he spoke to Barbara. They had met once or twice before that. And he thanked her very much for caring for his wife. Can you imagine how grateful you would be to somebody who sat with your dying wife or husband when you couldn't be there? And he said, if there's anything I can do for you, what can I do for you? And she said, I'd like to learn how to paddle a canoe. So that started it.
And a duck hunting trip.
Oh, the duck hunting trip. You know what? There's a possibility that someday this story will be made into a movie. And I've seen a screenplay. I mean, there's no, could be years and years away from now. But I saw the screenplay for it, and I thought, well, one excellent thing was that it gave Russell a voice. Right. Because in my book, it's all Barbara's voice because it's all her letters and diaries. But imagine, Angela, you can imagine this. The light in the early morning with the sun coming up and the ice and the birds and the little islands and stuff, and silently paddling through the ice, and it'd be so cinematic, so gorgeous. So yeah, I think he kissed her that day, I think.
It's funny you mentioned a screenplay because you knew their daughter and you knew them both, Barbara and Russell. Did you feel any pressure when you were writing? I mean, you're a journalist, so you're used to writing the truth, but did you feel pressure, I guess, to depict your friends' parents in a more positive light? And were you ever tempted to just say, the heck with it, I'm going to fictionalize this?
Oh, no, gosh. No, never. You know, I had such a lot of excellent material. There were no gaps, you know, like the only gap, I speculated about one thing. I speculated about what happened when her engagement failed. I knew she was engaged because I found that out when I went to New York, but I didn't know what broke it up. And I did talk to a couple of relatives who speculated and told me what the talk was in the family. So I put that in the book. I didn't have anything else. And Marjorie, their daughter, she did not know the exact reason why that engagement failed and wasn't even positive that there had been an engagement. But I wrote a lot of the book when I'd visit Marge out in Kelowna and be there at the house with her because all of the original documents were there in her house, all the diaries and the letters and everything else was all there. And I would check things with her. I mean, we'd be at the breakfast table and I'd say, Marge, when your mother did this and how did she wear her hair? Was it pulled back or did you think that your mother would have said this or would have done that? If I've said this, does this sound like your mother? And she would give me the okay. I definitely wanted her to be happy with it, but I also wanted it to be correct.
Mm-hmm. And that's a balancing act.
Yeah, but you know what? I wasn't writing about a serial murderer. Wasn't that hard?
Well, a friend's mother. So that's a balancing act. Yeah.
Well, she gave me lots of good stuff. You know, Barbara was a good writer.
Yeah, she was.
Yes, and you know, she continued to talk about Labrador. She gave little talks when they moved to British Columbia to Vancouver Island. She sometimes would give talks. She showed her slides. You know, she had done this when she was a volunteer with the Needlework Guild of America and with the Grenfell Association. When she came back from St. Anthony, she, you know, gave talks, and she gave talks when she took a break that year between when she and Russell decided to get married and then when they actually got married. She took a break, went back to New York. She gave a couple of talks. So she was always aware of, you know, presenting this story. And, you know, I had her way of presenting the story, which I also illustrated in the book and used clips from that stuff in the book.
The needlework thing sounds so demure, but she was also helping Russell with his clothing, right? With his trapper clothing.
Oh, yeah.
Sewing skills, yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, if a trapper didn't know how to sew himself, he would be in a very hard way. But Russell was fortunate that winter that he had a very expert sewer staying in the same tilt with him.
Mine, and what did you think when you were reading the parts of the book, you know, where they're in the tilt and they're on the trap line, having trapped yourself?
A couple different things. I think that a couple things come to my mind, and that is that, you know, she was worried about being a hindrance to him, and slowing him down, and you know, she hurt her knee and this and that, and she wanted to get to him. But I think she was also a help to him, like you just mentioned. She sewed his clothes, she baked bread all the time, she's you know, doing all these other things that he would have had to do or had not have it done for him if she wasn't there. So I think she was both. She was a hindrance, but she was also a help. And even though he was going on the trap line by himself for many years and staying away for many months by himself, it must have been good for him to have that little bit of company around, you know, to eat the meal with. And even though she said, you know, he didn't talk very much, stuff, that company there must have been good for him, I think.
I think so too. And Barbara died in the late 1980s, or I think that's when it was. Russell lived until he was 94. So I had lots of time to talk to him when I would go out to Kelowna. When I started to transcribe these diaries, and Marjorie and I together, because I was reading the handwriting, I say, Marge, this is your mother's handwriting here. What does this say? Until I learned her handwriting, you know, because we were working together on the transcriptions and stuff. And I remember, well, Russell was then living right next door to Marge and her husband, Don. And he would come over to her house every evening for supper, always carrying a bottle of red wine for supper. And we talked about this. And I'd say, Russell, today I was reading this. And I'd have to shout at him because he was so deaf then, you know. And I say, you know, Russell, she's writing about how she's worried that you're sorry you brought her up there and she's a drag on you, and she's afraid that you're sorry that you brought her and that she's no help to you at all. And he said, what? And I said, that's what she said in the diary when she was writing it at the time. And he said, she was a good help to me. And I thought to myself, if only you had said that to her back then, right? But the Labrador man is not a big gabber, right, Mina?
Right, yeah. And I think the way of the Labrador men, especially in those days, I'm not sure if it's changed a lot now, but I think it's changed some, is showing emotion and feelings and stuff. That, at one point she said, she's waiting to hear those 3 little words. It was something like that. And did, but for him to bring her on his trap line and to stay with him, for her to stay with him for the 6 months, then he had to love her. There's no doubt about it.
They stayed together all their lives after that.
Yeah.
And when they went to British Columbia, he got a salmon fishing license and he fished, and she went with him.
Mhm.
She went with them on the fishing boat. And in the fall, they get in their truck and they drive up to the mainland of BC, go up the Alaska Highway and go moose hunting. So they did a lot of things together, things that they love to do. They flew back to the trap line once. They came back to Labrador and they hired someone to fly them out. They knew they wouldn't be able to go up in canoe, right? And they flew them out and they went to, I guess they must have landed on a lake near to where the trap line was. And Russell was able to actually put his hands on one of his old traps.
Oh, wow.
Oh, yeah.
It was around Winnicopow Lake, where he was coming out.
It was at the end of the lake, and then on the southwest, on a southwest angle from the end of Winnicopow. So off in the country, Fig River.
A long lake, that is.
It is. And I did the same trip that you did, paddling down from Churchill Falls. I wouldn't want to have paddled up it, especially when they did, because back then that was a full force river with no reservoir. And it was described, I used this in the book, by some guys from Life magazine, I think it was, or was it Life magazine, who said it was like riding a locomotive when you came down it in the old days. And the only places it was like that when I was on the river, and probably the same for you, was when you were in the rapids.
Yes.
Yeah.
And when I read parts in the book and reminded myself today about the Devil's Hole,
Yeah.
I had the fear of God put in me about coming down through the Devil's Hole, and it was like you said, it was before or after the Devil's Opportunity, so it was way easier when I paddled it than when they would have adventures.
Absolutely. Well, one of my mother's uncles, Fred Gowdy, died the year before, 2 years before Barbara and Russell went up that river for the first time. And Fred was one of the most experienced trappers on the river. And he got his foot tangled up in the tracking line. And there was nothing that could be done about it. And they were in a rapid, and that was it. He was gone, and his body was never found. And I wrote about that in the book. You probably remember reading it. And she was really sad about that because he was a sweet man. And, he was my mother's uncle. Fred was married to my mother's aunt, Lila McLean. Becky. She was a Becky. And Lila, not Lila, Lila. And my mother felt that his spirit was still there because my brother did a canoeing trip. Oh gosh, this would be almost 50 years ago now. And my mom thought Uncle Fred would keep an eye on him. Yeah.
Yeah, it must have been scary for her to know that one of the most experienced people traveling that river can still die on the river.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. It's really sad.
We'd love to hear some questions from the audience. If anyone else has canoed the Grand River or dealt with the Devil's Hole like Mina. Or if you haven't and you just have a question for Anne, please, write in the chat, and we'll ask them for sure. And as a writer, as someone, who with 30 odd years of journalism training, how was this experience different, writing this book?
Oh, I think I said to you once before, Angela, about how happy I was to be working on a book where I was only all by myself doing it and didn't have a newsroom full of chatter going on all around me and phones ringing and stuff like that. You could concentrate on what you were doing. And the luxury of taking the time that you needed to do it right. But I knew what a great story this was. When people would ask me years ago when I was working on this, what are you doing anyway? What are you working on? I said, well, I'm working on a book about, I said, well, I'll put it to you this way. If Tarzan was a Labrador fur trapper and Jane was from Manhattan, this would be their story. Oh, okay.
That's a good elevator pitch, Anne.
Yeah, but now I don't know if anybody remembers Tarzan. Depends how old you are, I guess. But I knew I had so much material. Once I got into these diaries and letters, and then I found more stuff when I started talking to other relatives and so on. I mean, Marge and I went to Maine to see her cousin, Pete Mundy, and to talk to him. He was so pleased that we were working on this. He loved his Aunt Barbara. And he had a bunch of stuff. He brought out a cardboard box and we were rifling through it. And that's where I got the letter that Mrs. Mundy wrote in 1935, I think it was, after Barbara came back from St. Anthony. And she said that she didn't want to leave Barbara alone in the house. She said, I can't go to see you in Chicago. She was writing to her own mother, because I can't leave Barbara alone in the house. There's too many beaux, B-E-A-U-X, too many men around. And I thought, well, Barbara was like 23 or 24 years old then, but this was a very good indication. Also, her mother referred to, don't mention the divorce, like her mother was traumatized by the fact that she had to go to Las Vegas and get a divorce, which many rich people did at that time. So that was how I found that one really important letter, by going to someone's house and going through a box of stuff that he had. He didn't even know he had that letter.
That's great. A little sense of discovery.
Oh, I love the when you find something when you're doing research.
We have a few notes from the audience. Catherine says she can't wait to see the movie. And Sonia Knudsen says, was there a moment or some specific event that prompted you to begin writing the book?
Yeah, there was. When I was visiting Marge in Kelowna, and we were sitting in the comfortable couches in the living room one day gabbing about stuff, and she said, and my God, I got all this stuff of my mother's and I don't know what I'm going to do with it. And I said, what do you mean? Like, what kind of stuff? And she said, letters and diaries and maps and books and, all clippings and pictures. And I said, can I look at it? And sure, you can look at it, So I started looking. I said, Marge, can I do something with this? Sure, absolutely. Go ahead. I mean, I had to. It was presented on a platter in front of me, this beautiful amount of material. And I thought, some people scratch around trying to find stuff, when they're working on a project like this. And I had a treasure trove, so I had to do something with it.
Noel Schul wants to know if Mundy is a common name. In St. John's, there's Mundy Pond and a road named after it. Any relevance to the people in your book?
Not as far as I know. I don't think there's any Newfoundland connection at all with the Manhattan Mundys.
Mina, have you got another question?
I don't, but I got another thing that I'd just like to mention. That is the relationship that she had with the Innu, and how at first, and I mean, I've heard that all my lives, that the Innu, took people's provisions from the scaffolds and this and that. But they always shared. And the feeling that she had when she went to that tent that day and had a meal with the the Innu family. And so she was mad about them taking the food, and this is our land and our stuff and that. But then acknowledging that really the Innu were already there before they were, and how that relationship changed once she got in with the Innu lady family. And also the other one was when they brought the baby from across the river.
Yes,
That was wrapped up so beautifully. And
yes.
I just imagine the expression on her face, because I still find it beautiful. I live around all the time, but for somebody coming and seeing that for the first time, must have been pretty amazing for her.
Yeah, and if somebody was doing a fictionalized version of this story, they would have written it the way it actually was, which was she had great trepidation and was very anxious about the Innu people. And then Russell got angry and they marched over to where they knew where they found the camp. And he was angry about, they took this and the men negotiated. And the guy said, well, we're going to give it back to you. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. And then the tablecloth was put down and they sat down and they had something to eat. And someone fixed her snowshoe, or I can't remember what it was. But suddenly it was like all the tension was gone. And how happy she was, too, to see some other people. And then she also made the note, and we're going to see them again after Christmas or something. There was a plan then to have another get together. It's not like they were the best friends, lifelong friends, but I deliberately put other examples in the book of that kind of interaction on the trap line because, what was his name? His last name was White.
Lee.
No, his brother went.
Gerald
White,
yeah.
Gerald went trapping and when he was like 14 years old or something, 15 years old, and he was alone. And an Innu family, and again, this story's in the book, Innu family came upon him and he didn't speak their language and they spoke a few words of his. Eventually, a lot of trappers actually learned how to speak some Inuimuin. And he said he knew what the older lady was saying. She was saying, you should not be up here by yourself. And in that section of the book, I wrote about how Innu people did not do that. They didn't go out in the bush alone. They traveled in families.
Mm-hmm.
There was always somebody around to help you. That they thought the trappers were crazy going alone, going up here, going there. And 15 years old, going alone, they didn't think that was good at all. And Gerald said that in the summer, when the Innu people came back to Northwest River, 2 kids from that family came to check on him to see if he'd gone home all right. Yeah.
Well, it is crazy. I'm thinking of my kids being alone for 6 months in the Labrador wild, having to trap their own food. I can't imagine. They can't even get their own supper. We have another comment from Catherine. She wonders if the Michelin name you mentioned, Anne, is any connection to Alistair Michelin, Goose Bay, who has the camp on Eagle River.
Oh, all the Michelins are connected. One of my great-grandfather was married to 2 different Michelins, so I've got Michelin ancestry as well. Probably you do too, right, Monty? You said that, didn't you?
Yes, well, my father is Alan Michelin.
There.
And Alistair Michelin's father was Selby Michelin, who was the brother of Cyril Michelin, who was her friend, Florence and Cyril, in the book.
Yeah, and Selby is also mentioned in the book because he took her on a trip with a dog team one time.
That's right. So that's Alistair's father is Selby.
Yeah. There must be, I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of us.
Yes.
Who are all related.
Yeah.
In Labrador. And I feel when I go to Northwest River that whether I know it or not, I am related probably to everybody here.
Mm. Yeah.
Distantly now, but nevertheless.
The Labrador version of all my relations. Marge Grove says on YouTube, we all can't wait to see the movie. Now, do you have anything to do with the movie, Anne?
No, only had to say somebody could have the option.
Right.
But I got my fingers crossed and I'd love to see that movie. But I mean, it hasn't got a superhero unless you call, paddling up the Churchill River and living in the wilderness in Labrador a feat of superness. But I know I still hopeful that people will be able to get the money together to make that movie. Anybody who wants to invest would be more than welcome, I'm sure.
I wanted to. I'm going to go to the slide of your favorite Newfoundland authors in a minute, but I have one other question, and that is about Barbara's photographs. They're really beautifully, conceptualized photos, really nicely framed. She had a talent for that, for sure. Are there more, or just the ones that are in the book?
There are loads of photographs. Loads.
Hear that, Mina? Do you hear that, Mina?
But Marge has given photograph albums of those photographs to the Labrador Heritage Museum, not the Interpretation Center, but the Heritage Museum that's in the Hudson Bay Company store in Northwest River. They've got albums of Barbara's photographs. And Marge has a lot of probably the full collection of photographs. And I'm sure one of those days we'll decide that it should go somewhere for safekeeping, or copies of it anyway.
Yeah.
So yeah, there are lots and lots of beautiful photographs. I mean, she took the photograph that's on the cover of the book, of the snowshoe prints in the snow. And Russell must have snapped the one that's on the back of the book of her paddling and the dog with his head stuck up right in the corner. Yeah, there's lots of good, and she had a good camera. And she would send the films out to New York to be processed.
Right. It's an amazing legacy, this book, and what an amazing woman she was, and to capture the history of that time in images and in words, and her voice comes through so strong.
It does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mina, before we go to Anne's picks, do you have another question or a sort of closing comment you'd like to make?
No, not really. I'd just like to thank Anne for writing this book and documenting the history of our Labrador.
Thank you, Mina, very much, and I'm glad you were here tonight.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Yes, Mina, it was great to meet you and have your perspective. Thank you.
You're
All
welcome.
right. So, Anne, your local literature picks. We've got a slide of your picks. You're going to tell us a little bit about each one.
Yes, I am. True North by Elliot Merrick. He's a Grenfell Mission volunteer, another privileged young adventure-seeking American. He wrote this wonderful book about the winter of 1930-31 that he and his wife, nurse Kate Austin, spent on a trap line with trapper John Michelin. And that story greatly influenced Barbara Mundy Groves in her decision to volunteer to go to Labrador. She knew the Merricks and admired them very much. She called them Bud and Osty. She knew their nicknames. And she often saw them at Grenfell Mission alumni events in New York. The Lost Canoe, A Labrador Adventure, is by Lawrence W. Cody. And this book tells the story of the retracing of the difficult path of an exploratory expedition by Englishman Hesketh Pritchard to the interior of Labrador in 1910. Using Pritchard's published accounts and photos, over 3 summers, Larry Cody and friends walked the trails and paddled the rivers, hoping to find any trace of a canoe that was left behind by Pritchard. And they had a photograph of the location, so they did eventually, spoiler, find it. It is a great read for anybody who's interested in the exploration and natural history of Labrador. And a work of fiction by my friend Rosalind Gill, Too Unspeakable for Words. It's a short story collection that will strike a chord for anyone who grew up in St. John's, and especially for any Spencer girls. The Anglican school is one of the influences of Gill's deft handling of childhood, teenage years, and young womanhood in town. The dilemmas and dynamics of family life, friendships, and love relationships are treated with affection and with humor. And Ray Guy, Portrait of a Rebel by another friend of mine, Ron Crocker. And the work of the prolific journalist, satirist, and commentator has been thoroughly researched by his longtime friend, author Ron Crocker. And the book is not just the story of Ray Guy's career and life, but it also casts the reader back to the days of Joey Smallwood, the only premier for the first 23 years of Newfoundland's time as a province. And it's a backstage look also at the operations of the Evening Telegram newsroom during those years when few people dared to criticize the premier. It's about how power worked in this new province and how Guy's columns could not be ignored. And finally, Where Once They Stood, Newfoundland's Rocky Road Towards Confederation by Raymond B. Blake and Melvin Baker. It's a clear, carefully investigated history of events leading up to Confederation in 1949, with what some people might think of as a controversial conclusion that those who voted in 2 referenda in 1948 were engaged and made informed choices about what was at stake. Attention is also paid to the part female voters played in the final outcome. And in my estimation, this is not a book for those who believe conspiracy theories. So those are my 5 picks.
Thank you. When I look at those picks, I wonder what you're up to next. Are you going to tread into the waters of fiction, or are you going to stay firmly in the nonfiction world?
I'm thinking nonfiction world. I'm very interested in my vastly extended Labrador family and those people, and I'm going to try to do something about them.
Yeah, there's so many stories to be told. I get a sense, you know, these Barbara and Russell stories so amazing.
Yeah, lots of
Thank
stories.
you, Anne.
My pleasure, Angela, and my thanks to the selection committee who picked my book. Thank you.
It was great to chat with you about something other than CBC work, and nice to hear about your adventures writing this book.
Thanks again, Angela, and thanks to Janet and to Heidi as well.
Well, as is tradition, we always announce the next book before we wrap up our coastlines. And I'm very pleased to say that the next selection will be Dr. Lisa Moore's This Is How We Love. Lisa is no stranger to the Memorial literary community. She's a professor in the creative writing program, and she's mentored countless authors from this province. Please tune in on October 25th to discuss this heartbreaking, heartwarming novel that will have you holding your breath and laughing out loud all at once. And thanks for being here, everyone. I apologize for my wonky internet. I hope it wasn't too brutal. And we'll see you next time. And thanks very much to Anne Budgell and to Heidi and to Janet and to John Duff for getting us online and keeping us online throughout Coastlines. Thanks, everybody.